Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by fully endorsing the sentiments you expressed regarding the appalling Russian invasion of an entirely unjustified war against Ukraine, and share your salute for the extraordinary courage, valor, and commitment of the people of Ukraine. Chairman Powell, welcome. I do hope we process your nomination soon. Of course, I've been advocating that we do that for some time now. But in the meantime, I do know that you and your fellow FOMC members are fully able to do your job of fighting inflation. And obviously, there's a lot of work to do on that front. January's inflation reached a 40-year high of 7.5%. And inflation like that is doing real damage to average Americans. Some of my colleagues like to observe that wages are growing. The problem is inflation is growing faster. And that causes workers to fall further and further behind, and that's what's happening today. Savers, of course, are earning virtually zero on their savings, while inflation significantly erodes the value of those savings. Our current zero interest rate monetary policy that we've had for some time now is probably appropriate at a period of economic crisis or during a recession. It's hard to see that that makes sense during a period of multi-decade high inflation. Of course, profligate fiscal policy of the last year has also contributed to inflation. Democrat supporters of blowout deficit spending bills like the American Rescue Plan and Build Back Better have looked to blame others for the consequences of their own misguided policy. First, they blamed global supply chains. Now they've shifted their blame to greedy corporations. Actually, inflation is pretty easy to understand. It results from more money chasing fewer goods. The administration's policies, such as overregulation and a war on American energy, have limited the production of goods. And meanwhile, reckless spending has resulted in more money chasing those goods. Of course, the Fed's accommodative monetary policy has further stimulated demand. For several years now, I've warned that it could be extremely difficult to put the inflation genie back in the bottle. Well, the genie is out, and the Fed is behind the curve. We need to act with urgency to get inflation under control. Mr. Chairman, I'm also deeply troubled by what appears to be a growing urge to use financial regulators in general and the Fed in particular to tackle complex political questions that are outside of our financial and monetary system. Questions like how and how quickly to transition to a lower carbon economy. Questions like how to address racially charged social issues, or even how do we improve primary and secondary education. Now, there's no doubt these are very important issues, but they're wholly unrelated to the Fed's limited statutory mandates and expertise. And yet the Fed has been weighing in on every one of these issues. Some intend to use the Fed's recently developed climate scenario analysis as a mechanism, as part of a tool to steer capital away from carbon-intensive industries. All 12 reserve banks have hosted a Racism in the Economy series where invited speakers advocated for specific policies, including racial reparations and defunding the police, among other very liberal proposals. And the Minneapolis Fed is actively lobbying to change Minnesota's constitution on the issue of K-12 education policy. Does anyone really think that these activities are within the Fed's statutory mandates? Of course not. What they are is they're challenging and complex issues that require really difficult trade-offs. And in a democratic society, those trade-offs have to be made by elected representatives who are directly accountable to the American people. Consider some trade-offs associated with addressing global warming. Now, if we limit domestic oil and gas production, Americans will pay more at the pump. How much more is appropriate? If we suddenly limit domestic production without feasible energy alternatives, our nation and the world will become more reliant on fossil fuels from autocratic nations. We're watching that play out. When does that reliance present an unacceptable national and global security threat? These are just examples of the unlimited number of equally challenging trade-offs for all of these politically charged topics, none of which should be decided by unelected and unaccountable central bankers. And yet some of the reserve banks are diving right in. And when I've requested additional information about their activities, the reserve banks stonewall me. When I ask the board to address the issue, everyone passes the buck. The Fed board says, oh, those things are up to the reserve banks, even though the board oversees the reserve banks. And except through the Fed board, the reserve banks are completely unaccountable to Congress. So when I think about this state of affairs, Mr. Chairman, I can only conclude that we need to think seriously about reforming the structure of the Fed. In my view, any Fed reform should preserve and strengthen monetary policy independence, but it should also develop mechanisms to enforce the existing statutory limits on Federal Reserve activity that are not being complied with today. That would require also proper congressional oversight by increasing transparency. So here are 3 reform ideas that we ought to discuss. First, unlike the main Fed board, the reserve banks are not subject to FOIA. Well, that should change. Second, we should consider whether or not to subject Federal Reserve Bank heads, the regional reserve bank heads, to presidential appointment and Senate confirmation. Third, we ought to examine the historical 12 reserve bank structure. That dates back to a very, very different time. For example, it might make sense to consolidate them into 5 banks and make each one a permanent voter on the FOMC. Or maybe we should eliminate the reserve banks entirely and have the main Fed board assume these responsibilities. To be clear, I'm not specifically advocating any one of these, but I think we have to consider these and other possibilities. I don't present these ideas lightly, but the Fed was given independence to insulate monetary policy from politics, and Congress has a responsibility to ensure that the Fed does not become a political actor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.